A warm welcome to our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. I'm Joke Rogers in Lagos. We begin with updates on the 17-year-old boy who was shot by police during a traffic stop in Paris in France. The mother, Monia, is said to be leading a tribute protest in his honor through the Paris suburbs. Before the march began, she gave an interview to a French media outlet, Blast, in which she remembered her son as a respectful, kind boy. She recalled her last moments with the young man, identified as Nahel M., saying he told me, "Mum, I love you," only to receive a call an hour later telling her that her son had been shot. She said her life and her heart had been taken away from her. She misses him and that this has been a painful experience for her. Thousands of people have joined the march in Paris calling for justice for Nahel, many wearing T-shirts emblazoned with "Justice for Nahel" and also carrying other anti-police slogans. About 40,000 police officers have been deployed across France to deal with protests that broke out after his death. At least 180 people have been arrested so far, following 2 nights of protests. And Nanterre prosecutor Pascal Prache said that the police officer who fatally shot the 17-year-old boy in Paris has been placed under formal investigation for voluntary homicide. Under the French legal system, this is akin to being charged in Anglo-Saxon jurisdictions. Addressing the press, he said, "Based on the investigation and the elements we gathered, the court considers that the legal conditions for the use of force have not been fulfilled." The deadly shooting of the teenager of North African descent during a traffic stop triggered 2 nights of rioting across France, prompting President Emmanuel Macron to convene a crisis meeting with senior ministers earlier in the day. He says the teenager was known to police for previously failing to comply with a traffic stop order. Prosecutors also confirmed the boy failed to obey the officer's orders. And just to understand what security officials have been going through over the last few days, this is what the protests have looked like. Fireworks being shot at the police, cars set ablaze in the working-class suburbs. This happened yesterday after the President, Emmanuel Macron, condemned the police action as inexcusable on Nanterre's Avenue Pablo Picasso. A trail for overturned vehicles burned as fireworks fizzed at police lines. Today, the protests are in the form of a tribute march in Nanterre, where huge crowds have turned up to show support for Nahel's relatives. The French Prime Minister has condemned the violence. Also, she told the media nothing justifies the violence that occurred, but she has also condemned the attacking of symbols of the Republic, of the public facilities, as unacceptable and pleaded for de-escalation of the violence. And so let's focus more a bit on the 17-year-old man who was killed. Nahel M. was an only child brought up by his mother. He had been working as a pizza delivery man and played rugby league. And not much is said about his father, and that's because he probably never even knew him. But he was well loved in Nanterre, where he lived with his mother. Nahel had spent the past few years playing for the Pirates of Nanterre Rugby Club. He had been part of an integration program for teenagers struggling in school, run by an association called Oval Citoyen. The program was aimed at getting people from deprived areas into apprenticeships, and Nahel was learning to be an electrician. Nahel had been the subject of as many as 5 police checks since 2021, what are known as Rufus d'Obtember refuses to cooperate. As recently as last weekend, he had reportedly been placed in detention for such a refusal and was due to appear before a juvenile court in September. Much of the trouble he was in recently involved cars. Let's get back to our top story in France, where tributes have been held, led by the mum of the teenager that was shot by police. The VOA's Lisa Bryant is in Paris for us. Lisa, great to see you today.
Great to see you. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well, thank you. So let's get straight to it. Give us a sense of how the large crowd is paying tribute to Nahel today. How is it going in France?
It's pretty tense in France right now. There were thousands of people out in Nanterre this afternoon. And as you said, it was a protest led by Nahel's mother. That's a 17-year-old that died on Tuesday. There, people were brandishing signs and that said "Police kill" and "Justice for Nahel." So there's a lot of anger, and there's also a feeling of frustration by young people and others that this is not the first time this has happened. So some feel that this is just an old story that's being replayed.
So what's the plan at the moment? Following the tribute march across Paris today, are there going to be more planned marches and other protests like this one in the coming days?
First, it's important to also note that, quite recently, apparently one of the two police officers involved in the incident, the one who allegedly had a gun, was charged with voluntary homicide later today. I don't know if that will do anything to calm the violence, but police authorities, French authorities, are braced for more violence tonight. Thousands of police officers have been called up across France. I think something like 5,000 in Paris alone. So there's a sense, or at least a fear, that this is not going to end anytime soon, or at least not in the days to come.
Yes, as you mentioned, there have been violent protests over the past 2 days. Thousands of police officers have been deployed across France, to quell, other violent protests. Cars have been burnt, a range of issues over that shooting, which I believe, I hear, is a rare occurrence in Paris, although people said it's not the first time it's happening. You have said so too. Well, so what have people said about the police action? And is this, the first time such an incident is happening in years now, talking about a longer stretch of time?
People say, at least people from, what they call here the banlieue, which is the very low income, often lots of immigrants, suburbs around France, in Paris, around Paris, for example. They feel that this is just, police violence is a daily occurrence. I talked to one young man who is kind of a youth leader. He's got an NGO that helps young people to find jobs or get back on their feet. And for him, it's just an old story. He lives not in Nanterre, where the young man was killed, but he actually lives in another suburb in Paris. This is, as you had pointed out, yes, this has happened before. There was, for example, a young man who was detained, a young ethnic African man who was detained in 2016 by police and died in police custody. That unleashed a lot of anger. And when the whole issue of George Floyd, the black man in the United States who died under police custody, erupted with protests around the world, there were thousands of French who also remembered what happened in 2016. In 2005, I think that's the thing that a lot of French remember at fear. There were riots across the country for weeks following the death of two young teenagers who were fleeing police. They were electrocuted. It wasn't the fault of the police, but people blamed them anyway. So this, for some people, is a long story, and there's a lot of simmering anger. On the other hand, police say that these tough neighborhoods are becoming increasingly violent. And so there's anger and a communication disconnect, let's say, on both sides.
Right, and the young man involved in all of this, he's said to have been a respectful person, but he had been involved in police checks since 2021. Has the police justified the action in any way?
Well, it depends on which officers or which police unions you talk to. I mean, I think the sense was, that there were originally claims by the police that the young man was trying to ram them with his car. There was a police check at a stop for not adhering to rules of the road. There was a video that circulated on the internet that seems to completely discount that, and it shows that this two police officers, one with a gun, the car is stopped. It starts to go, but he's not at all in the direction of the police officers. And at that point, according to the video, you see an officer firing point blank inside the car, presumably at the driver. So that suggests that the allegations that were initially circulated by the police were not true. And that seems to be the case of what the prosecutor appears to be thinking as well.
Right, and so the people have decided to march and protest and lead tributes to the young man. And then, of course, you mentioned that there's been a charge against the officer involved. What else does the government intend to do about this?
Well, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, has said there is no excuse for the death of a young person, but he's also kind of said there's no excuse for the kind of violence that's come out. The prime minister has called for calm. There's obviously going to be, judicial proceedings against the officer who's been charged. But I think a lot of people are sort of waiting and seeing how the next few days are going to unfold, whether there'll be more violence or not. And that might also, for the moment, the prime minister says there's not going to be a state of emergency, but the fact that she even named it suggests that this is something that they are considering.
Right. Lisa, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
And coming up after the break, presumed remains of passengers aboard the Titanic submersible that imploded is recovered by a Canadian ship. Welcome back to the program. The Nigerian mission in Libya has secured the release of 40 Nigerians from the Vera Al Ghanem detention facility in the country. A statement released by the chargé d'affaires of the Nigerian mission in Libya, Kabiru Musa, said they were detained for immigration offences. Mr. Musa said he admonished them to return home and to refrain from irregular migration. He also disclosed that they will continue to be catered for until they are repatriated. According to the statements, among the arrested Nigerians are 34 females and 6 males who were detained in the detention facility that is about 150 miles from Tripoli. It adds that the would-be traffickers lured most of them into traveling to Libya for greener pastures, but they ended up being exploited and sold into forced labor. Greece's former one-time leftist firebrand Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has resigned as leader of the Syriza party following a crushing defeat in Sunday's polls. The Conservative New Democracy Party won nearly 41% of the vote, leaving Syriza far behind on 18%. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who leads ND, says that he now has a strong mandate to move on the path of change. Mr. Mitsotakis beat Syriza in May, but called new elections in a bid to win a majority in the 300-member parliament. Under Greek rules, for a second election, the biggest party is awarded a bonus of between 20 and 50 seats. And presumed human remains of the imploded submersible has been recovered and brought back to land. The Titan submersible imploded while on a voyage to the century-old Titanic earlier this month, killing all 5 people on board. The debris is expected to shed more light on the cause of the catastrophic implosion that killed everyone on board. Ocean Gate Expedition CEO Stockton Rush, British Prime Minister Hamish Harding, Pakistani-born business leader Shazda Dawood and his 19-year-old son, Suleiman, and French oceanographer Paul-Henri Nargeolet. Meanwhile, chairman of the peer review group Marine Technology Society's committee, Will Conan, said the implosion of the vessel would have happened instantly.
Look, you give an air balloon to a 5-year-old and you tell it to poke it. It goes and a fraction of a second. The same thing happens in reverse in the ocean. You poke it, and in a fraction of a second, it's gone. So the implosion, it's a negative explosion, but it's the same pattern. It exploded inwards in a matter of a thousandth of a second. And it's probably a mercy, because that was probably a kinder end than the unbelievably difficult situation of being 4 days in a cold, dark, confined space. So this would have happened very quickly. I don't think anybody even had the time to realize what happened. So typically you'd want to land near it and then drive towards the Titanic. So, if they were 400 meters away, less than half a kilometer, that's not too bad. But it would indicate that it happened fairly early on. And from a technical point of view, I would speculate that something that puzzled me since Monday is how come they lost communication and tracking of the submersible right away on the way down. Because, there's typically redundancy. You have communication through voice. It's all acoustic, but you have a system for voice, you have a system for text, you have a system for range finding, you have a system for sonar. And it's based so that you have backup, so that not everything fails at the same time. That all of a sudden, which made the week terribly difficult to find out, well, what's going on and where are they? By the time you lose communication, it makes it so much harder. And it was curious that all systems stopped at the same time. Little did we ever suspect that. That was one of the options, but it was pretty far down the line. But that would explain why all these systems stopped immediately, and which indicates that would have happened on the way down, early in the dive.
To the UK now, and a London Court of Appeal has ruled that the country's planned deportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda is unlawful, a major setback for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Under the deal struck last year, Britain's government planned to send tens of thousands of asylum seekers who arrived on its shores more than 4,000 miles to the East African country. The first planned deportation flight was blocked a year ago in a last-minute ruling by the European Court of Human Rights, which imposed an injunction preventing any deportations until the conclusion of legal action in Britain. In December, the High Court ruled the policy was unlawful, and that decision was challenged by asylum seekers from several countries, along with human rights organizations.
That the deficiencies in the asylum system in Rwanda are such that there are substantial grounds for believing that there is a real risk that persons sent to Rwanda will be returned to their home countries where they faced persecution or other inhumane treatment when in fact they have a good claim for asylum.
So let's bring in immigration lawyer Daya Fadina. He joins me from London. Good to see you again on the program.
Oh, good evening. It's a pleasure, and good evening to your audience.
Right, so this judgment by the Court of Appeal only re-emphasizes the High Court's decision back in December. If this was such a good deal as was widely praised by the UK government and by the Rwandan government last year, why are there legal roadblocks?
Oh, hello. First of all, the judgment of, I think, December last year, that judgment, the High Court judgment actually stated, in favor of the UK government, that very particular policy, at that point was legal. But the Court of Appeal is now stating very clearly that policy is unlawful. Well, regarding the legal roadblocks concerning this very particular case and the situation with the Home Office, of course, there will always continue to be roadblocks as long as the public perceive this very particular, ardent, gung-ho draconian policy has been morally reprehensible and utterly inhumane, really. So long as there's that situation, they will continue to be the roadblocks. It's very clear, as far as this matter is concerned, that the Home Office would really want him to continue with this policy, would indeed be in breach of the UN Convention, 1951 UN Convention to do with refugees. It would also be contravening the Human Rights Act, 1998. And as long as the government wants to continue pushing this policy, of course, indeed, there will be roadblocks. And as long as they are not prepared to understand and appreciate the fact that the Court of Appeal stated very clearly that the monitoring of procedures of the Rwandan asylum system is not just robust enough for them to want to conclude that it will be okay and safe for asylum seekers to be sent to Rwanda. So in that respect, indeed, the Court of Appeal's decision stands and is quite legal at this point in time.
And why is it so important for Britain to move these asylum seekers when it's also clear that it's hard to keep them from coming back? Okay, you didn't get the question.
Hello, I think I'm losing you. I did not hear your last question, sorry.
Right, I said, why is it important for Britain to move these asylum seekers when it's clear now that it's hard to keep them from coming into Britain?
Yes. Yeah, well, indeed. Look, the situation is this, and it's very, very simple. We cannot, I mean, it's the case that it's going to be difficult for asylum seekers to be removed to Rwanda, and at the same time, they're also finding it very hard to stop asylum seekers from coming to the UK via boats through the channel. I think the best option and the best solution that the Home Office should be looking at, that's the government, is to have far, far better, safer ports and safer routes as to where asylum seekers could claim asylum in any part of the world, instead of allowing them to at least be going through the Mediterranean Sea, the Channel, risking their lives. If it's the case that there is fair persecution in different instances, a country like Syria or Iran, or Iraq or any of the other countries, it should be very clear. They should make it very clear that there will be safer routes for people to be able to actually claim this asylum. That could be a very, very better way of dealing with this matter than going gung-ho on saying that the only best option for us to actually to deal with this matter is to be sending asylum seekers to Rwanda, a country where that is not particularly recognized, has been up there when it comes to the protection of fundamental human rights and freedoms. So I think that could really be a better way of actually looking at the matter, or a solution to that matter in itself.
And there have been a number of condemnations from high-profile individuals on the deal, even when it was signed last year. But it does not answer the question of what can be done for these people whose fate lies in the balance as we speak. Yes, indeed. On points of fact, last year, there were so many, high-profile personalities who condemned this policy, and rightly so. And I think their condemnations were indeed in tandem with public perception and the public opinion concerning this matter. So indeed, so many people actually criticize this very particular policy. And it's very simple. Of course, the Sunak government believes that what they are doing is right. They also believe that they have a memorandum of understanding with Rwanda regarding this policy. But so long as the Court of Appeal has truly and really ruled that that policy in itself is unlawful. And it's simple what they should be doing. All they have to be doing is to respect the rule of law. There are rules, there are laws laid down to do with asylum seekers.
The rules are there for them to access and to be able to at least apply. The Human Rights Act is there. The UN Convention on Human Rights is also there, where anybody who wants to seek asylum due to persecution, that person should be allowed to seek asylum. So it's simple. They should just follow the rules, clear and very, very good on what should be done as far as their practice is concerned. So the situation shouldn't be in the balance at all. The laws are there to follow, and the Home Office, the government should be following these rules and regulations, strictly, to be able to at least get around the problem of so many asylum seekers in the UK.
Thanks again, Daya, for your thoughts on this.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
We're not quite done with that conversation. The UK government intends to appeal against the Court of Appeal ruling to send an asylum seekers to Rwanda. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said he fundamentally disagrees with the ruling, saying that the government will challenge it at the Supreme Court. Asylum Aid, the charity which brought the challenge, has welcomed the ruling, saying the decision is a vindication of the importance of the rule of law and basic fairness. According to Britain's Interior Minister, the court's decision on the deportation of asylum seekers is quite disappointing. But for the Rwandan government, it's an issue that the court's saying that Rwanda is not safe for asylum seekers and refugees that has caught its attention. A statement from the government spokesman Yolande Makolo says, while this is ultimately a decision for UK's judicial system, we take the issue with the ruling that Rwanda is not a safe country for asylum seekers and refugees as very importantly, Rwanda is one of the safest countries in the world, and we have been recognized by the UNHCR and other important international institutions for our exemplary treatment of refugees. We make a significant contribution of dealing with the impacts of the global migration crisis. Rwandans know what it means to be forced to flee home and make a new life in a country. As a society and as government, we have built a safe, secure, dignified environment in which migrants and refugees have equal rights and opportunities as Rwandans. Everyone relocated here under this partnership will benefit from this. And to the United States now, where the Supreme Court has ruled that universities can no longer consider a prospective student's race when deciding admission. It ends a decades-long practice of affirmative action where universities could take race into account in order to improve diversity. The case is concerned admissions at Harvard and the University of North Carolina and will impact admissions rules nationwide. Affirmative action first made its way into policy in the 1960s as many as all white schools began admitting minority students. Let's bring in our correspondent in Washington, D.C., Maria Bird. Maria, good to see you today.
Good to see you as well.
So help us unbundle this. What does this mean in layman's English?
This is a very tough day for America. This is a ruling that has come down that many believe will be a trickling effect. So we just unpack it very quickly here. This is a case that was put in place, affirmative action was put in place to ensure equity, equal opportunity. I don't know how equal we can always be when you're dealing with systemic racism in a country, but this was dealing with equity. This was really focusing on if you have individuals that apply of color, specifically African-American students, that should be put into account when you talk about the application pool. As we know previously, typically majority white institutions have very few, if any, African-American students. And so this forced to be able to be diverse environments. And so with this being overturned for colleges as Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, this now means that race is not put into consideration to ensure that you have a diverse student population. So as we know, the African-American population has dealt with whether it's severe poverty, whether it's educational disadvantages, or a host of other social economic challenges that have faced that community, which then will not be taken into consideration as you're looking at applicant pools and being able to admit students.
So what will that mean for African Americans and Black applicants to colleges and universities across America? They have to work harder, or what does it really mean for them?
Well, we have unfortunately seen where African and African American students will, as you just mentioned, potentially work harder. But what does work harder really look like? What does that really mean when you talk about a system that's really not designed for pure equity? We still have various challenges in our higher education system. We know that things like the SAT and other factors that are put into consideration about acceptance for a college typically are ones that have the balance is not always quite equitable in those cases. And so if you're talking about what's going to give an opportunity to those individuals, they're being already put at a position where it could be unbalanced. And so what we're going to potentially see is we're going to see areas where we're not going to see as diverse populations potentially in these colleges. And this is going to be a trickling down effect. Typically, when you see these type of cases overturned, you then begin to see other college admissions process, and it could even impact the workforce moving forward. We know that this was a 6-2 vote for Harvard University, so we see the majority of the Supreme Court was in favor of overturning this rule. For UNC, it was a 6-3 vote to overturn this. So there's quite a ways to go. We know the former president has already spoken out and said this is a great day for America. Senator McCarthy, the leader of the House, has said that this creates fair and equity. But what's fair and equity when we're still dealing with systemic racism in the country?
Yes. So help me understand this further. I may have a feeling that probably those who are more economically disadvantaged would be more affected than this. But what about those students that are coming, that want to get into college, and they're exceptionally, brilliant? They have the highest scores in their schools. How will this affect them getting into university? Will they be disadvantaged as well because of this new policy?
They could potentially. We know that legacy, we know that wealth does play a role. So if you are a second or third generation student at Harvard University and you have the same grades as someone else who might, to your point, be a person of color or disadvantaged that does not have that same legacy, are you going to be that chosen one for that space? There are legacy rules in place at many colleges. And so typically that legacy is going to get another point ahead of you. So that's where you're going to see some of the challenge there. And that goes back to socioeconomic. We know that those who are recent immigrants to the U.S., those who are of African American descent, don't have the same sort of legacy and wealth base as some of their white counterparts.
And will this affect international students from Africa?
Potentially, it could impact international students. It really is going to depend on the school's policy around how many international students they're hoping to accept. But we know that international students run up against a number of challenges with visas, and really depending on federal regulations as a result, as it relates to that as well.
Right. Thanks again, Maria. We'll have more from Maria in the course of this bulletin. But right now, we're going on a break and still ahead on the program. Grandparents race across the finish line in an epic race in Washington. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Let's get more from the U.S. and, of course, our correspondent, Maria. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced his Bidenomics agenda, which focuses on building the middle class. This agenda is key to the American middle class as the U.S. continues to battle with inflation. Our correspondent, Maria Bird, had a chat with the chair of the White House Economic Council.
Jared Bernstein, we thank you so much for joining us, as we know this is a big day to talk about the Biden economics. And so we really want to spend some time today, as we know the middle class has been suffering quite a bit ever since COVID, talking about the idea around building the middle class, a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach. Give us some insight into what that really means.
That would be my pleasure, Maria, and please call me Jared. You really landed in exactly where this starts, where Bidenomics begins, which is rejecting top-down, trickle-down economics, the notion disproved by decades of evidence that just cutting taxes for rich people helps the middle class, replacing that with bottom-up, middle-out growth based on 3 pillars: investing in America, reversing decades of disinvestment in some of our most important areas: education, environment, our ports, our water system, of course, our roads and bridges; empowering and educating workers, critical for people in the middle class to get ahead; and promoting competition so that we help lower costs faced by consumers and give our small businesses more of a fighting chance. That right there is a thumbnail sketch of the bottom-up, middle-out growth defined by Bidenomics.
Jared, you mentioned, kind of small businesses, but we also know there are many in the middle class or in the lower middle class that are underemployed. What is being done? I know that small businesses are the heartbeat and the breath of American kind of employment. What is being done to ensure that we're not looking at underemployment while we're looking at how Biden plans to grow the middle class?
So 2 points. The first one is a little bit gnarly, but it's really worth getting into because it's kind of fundamental, and I think it's not as widely appreciated. It is true that most businesses in America are small businesses, and it's very much true that they're the innovative lifeblood of so much of our economy. And it's very important to this president and vice president to make sure those entrepreneurial opportunities go to people from all communities, particularly communities of color. So that's something we've worked on. But it's also true that most people work for bigger companies. So most companies are small, but most people work for larger companies. And so the way you help, one of the critical ways you help the underemployed is to run a hot labor market, a tight labor market. We have a labor market where the unemployment rate has been under 4% for a year and a half. That is low unemployment, and it's persistently low unemployment. It's certainly helped some less advantaged communities. We've seen Black unemployment rates, Hispanic unemployment rates for women, all at historical lows. And that gives them more bargaining clout. That's pillar 2 of Bidenomics, empowering workers in part through tight labor markets. And we've seen that in some favorable wage trends. So one way to help the underemployed is to make sure that they have ample opportunities, both at large and small businesses.
You bring up key points around kind of the tight labor market, but we also know we're seeing a lot of the bigger companies downsize. KPMG is set to downsize. We know that Google is set to downsize. We know that Meta has been downsizing. How is that impacting the employment rates and also what you're looking at when you're discussing the tight labor markets?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of those firms, including some of the ones you mentioned, they saw just a real sharp uptick in the demand for their services around the pandemic. Some of these tech firms, when people were stuck at home on Zoom all day, on internet, buying electronics, demand for that went up a lot. As that has kind of normalized, gotten back to getting back to kind of where it was pre-pandemic, those firms have cut some of their workers as that rebalancing has been underway. Now, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. You get laid off, you don't care what some wonky economist calls it, it's being laid off. What's important, Maria, is to recognize that the numbers that I've been talking to you, they represent both layoffs but also job opportunities. And one of the things we've seen very clearly in tech is that people who get laid off in this very strong, robust job market with millions of open jobs, millions of vacancies, really historical records in terms of the number of job vacancies, they've been able to get re-employed quickly. Sometimes they're better jobs, sometimes, I'm going to be straight with you, they're not as good. So again, not sugarcoating it, but we should look at both sides of the equation, not just the kind of cuts as some of these firms get back to where they were before, but also the other opportunities in other sectors for people to move from where they were to where they are now.
And lastly, as we close, you mentioned communities of color being an area of emphasis with the Biden's economic agenda. What are the key highlights for communities of color, especially those who are the communities of color that are sitting at below the middle class and really sitting at the poverty level?
I think all 3 of the pillars of Bidenomics, as well as the bottom-up, middle-out, speak to that. So first of all, investments. One of the things that we're doing with our investments in public goods, water systems. You look at what happened in Flint, very much a community of color. this president is at the top of his agenda is getting rid of every single lead pipe in this country to make sure that children are no longer, literally poisoned by lead in the water. When we talk about empowerment and education, some of the deepest investments in HBCUs, in the university system, where many people of color attend college, increasing grants. You know, the president's student relief program, which disproportionately, again, helps people. And then when we get down to promoting competition and building entrepreneurship, as I mentioned earlier, from the campaign, going back to the campaign, I remember conversations with President Biden, Vice President Harris, that were framed around not just entrepreneurial opportunities, but entrepreneurial opportunities in communities of color. And so we've worked hard through our Small Business Administration to make sure people have access to the capital loans, to the process through that administration to be able to realize their entrepreneurial aspirations and, frankly, their economic potential.
Thank you so much, Jared Bernstein. We look forward to seeing how this all plays out in the coming days ahead.
Well, grandparents raced to cross the finish line last Sunday, replacing horses on the Emerald Down Racecourse in Auburn, Washington, as it hosted its first Grandparents' Weekend. Although some of the elderly participants took a tumble on the bumpy dirt track, many were able to complete the 40-yard race, and Steve Butler took the winner's title. In a post on social media, organizers said it was most likely the first time a sporting event celebrated grandparents. Some of them are still super fast. Well, that's the show today. Thank you for watching. I'm Daya Fadina.